The year was 1998, and a Russian professor named Igor Panarin was speaking to 400 delegates at a conference in Linz, Austria. Now, if you can remember all the way 2 decades ago, things were going pretty well for the United States. Our economy was booming, and we were the sole superpower in the world. While we were booming, Russia was in chaos. That decade alone, the wall had fallen and the Soviet Union had collapsed. The Russian ruble faced a currency and leadership crisis. And yet, a Russian professor, later revealed to be former KGB and a friend of Vladimir Putin, was explaining how America would collapse in about a decade. Reading from the Wall Street Journal in 2008, they said, "For a decade, Russian academic Igor Panarin has been predicting the U.S. will fall apart in 2010. For most of the time, he admits, few took his argument that an economic and moral collapse will trigger a civil war and the eventual breakup of the U.S. very seriously. Mr. Panarin posits in brief that mass immigration, economic decline, and moral degradation will trigger a civil war next fall and the collapse of the dollar. Around the end of June 2010 or early July, he says, the U.S. will break into 6 pieces, with Alaska reverting to Russian control." Here's the map that Panarin produced showing how we would break apart. Panarin went on to call the U.S. foreign debt a pyramid scheme, and he predicted that China and Russia would usurp Washington's role as a global financial regulator. Join me in the Economic War Room, where we will examine Panarin's predictions, what role they had in the 2008 financial collapse, and whether or not they may yet spell doom for America. 2 decades ago, Igor Panarin predicted the collapse of America, starting with a financial crisis. It almost happened just as he predicted. And while America didn't split into 6 units, there's no doubt that America is more divided today than ever before. And what he said about mass immigration, moral degradation, and China and Russia working to replace the dollar is almost ripped from the current headlines. Plus, we know that Russia actually did take a shot at us, hitting us exactly in the areas that Panarin said we were vulnerable. First, in the 2008 financial crisis, we know Putin ordered an attack on our economy. Hank Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, acknowledged this in his memoirs and later in a BBC interview. The BBC headline was, "Russia Planned Wall Street Bear Raid." Here's Paulson's quote, "I'm not going to name the senior person, but I was meeting with someone. That person told me that the Chinese had received a message from the Russians which was, hey, let's join together and sell Fannie and Freddie securities on the market. That was a signal that they were planning to take down U.S. Treasury debt, or the debt of our entities such as Fannie and Freddie." Here's what the BBC reporter said in his article. He said, "For me, this is pretty jaw-dropping stuff. The Chinese told Hank Paulson that the Russians were suggesting a joint pact with China to drive down the price of the debt of Fannie and Freddie, maximizing the turmoil on Wall Street. And we know the Russians did it. They dumped over $65 billion worth of their holdings in a matter of weeks. This seriously worsened the financial crisis just before the 2008 election. It seems obvious that the Russian attack in 2008 was designed to fulfill Panarin's prediction.